Hey everybody, it's Brian back with some ideas to help us be constructively disruptive, as our goal is to create workplaces and communities that help people become their best selves. I was recently thinking about the term childlike and what that means, and it caused me to think about one of my favorite movies. When I was like 9 or 10 years old, I was the weird little kid. I wasn't that into Star Wars or Indiana Jones. I loved the movie Big with Tom Hanks. The premise of the movie is that there's this kid at a carnival and he sees this Zoltar coin-operated fortune-telling machine, and he makes a wish that he wants to be a grown-up or to grow up. So he goes home, he goes to bed, and when he wakes up the next morning, he's grown up. He has like a 30-year-old body, but he retains his 9 or 10-year-old brain. So he's this kid living in a grown-up's body. And the movie progresses and goes on, but I remember he ends up getting a job working for a toy company where he gets to play with toys all day and provide feedback and interactions, and he gets to curiously play with toys and things and decide what works, what kids are gonna like, what might sell. And I remember thinking, man, what an awesome job. But again, being a weird little kid, I wasn't thinking about how awesome it would be to play with toys all day. Well, it would be cool to play with toys all day and get paid for that, but I was looking at, he got to have a job where he retained his childlike zest and enthusiasm for life. So fast forward to where I am now and thinking about, gosh, what I really get to do is to help create workplaces and communities that can help retain a little bit of that childlikeness. And so I was recently talking at an event to a group of people, and I said, hey, think of the terms childish and childlike. And I said, if we look them up in the dictionary, the two terms are kind of synonymous, but when we say them, we know there are two totally different connotations. And I had the audience write down, I said, write down a list of synonyms for the word childish. And they started writing things down, and these were things like petty, egocentric, jealous, needy, greedy, short-tempered, maybe even aggressive. And then I said, okay, we have a good list of what it means to be childish, and it tends to be negative. Write down words that you think are synonymous with the word childlike. And people started shouting out things like wonder, engaged, curious, fun-loving, full of delight, energetic, resilient. And I thought, wow, look at these two lists. And I had everybody look at your list and think about the words that we just said. Of these two lists, which words more often than not describe your workplace? And as you can imagine, there were some of those nervous chuckles in the audience as people were thinking, gosh, if I had to pick, my workplace is a lot more childish than it is childlike. Now, all of this talk about being childlike versus childish got me thinking about a book I had read called The Culture Code by Daniel Coyle. And in the introduction, he talks about some research that was done by a man named Peter Skillman at various universities. And he took groups of 4 and he gave them a task of building something. And I'm gonna read the list here. He gave them 20 pieces of uncooked spaghetti, 1 yard of transparent tape, 1 yard of string, and 1 standard-sized marshmallow. And he said to build the tallest structure you could, the only caveat being the marshmallow had to be on the top. The only real difference was in the groupings. They took groups of business students, university students, and the other groups were kindergartners. And they gave them these tasks, and then they observed them, and they measured how tall of a structure they could build. Now, if you put money down, most of us would put money on the university students. But astonishingly, time after time, the kindergartners were able to build taller structures. On average, kindergartners build structures using those ingredients that average 26 inches tall, whereas the university students only built, on average, structures that were 10 inches tall. They repeated this, and he mentions it in the book, that the kindergartners often beat lawyers and other professionals as well. So it's very interesting. But it was the ability for the kids to have a childlike approach to the work. They weren't worried about social class or social structures, who's in charge, who's smarter. And they just got after the task, and what looked like chaos in the end came together into a structured approach to building a taller structure than the adults. So my question to you is, what is your workplace? Is your workplace more childish or more childlike? And if it is more childish, what can you do to make it more childlike? Now you might say, I'm not an executive, or I'm not a manager, or I'm not in charge of HR. What can I do to change things? Well, you do have a sphere of influence. We all have places where we work and people around us. Think about if you came to work with a more curious, energetic, engaged attitude, a more childlike attitude every day. Might that rub off on some of the people around us? And eventually, might that rub off on our division and maybe even on our organization as a whole? I want to leave us with a final thought from 1 Corinthians 13, verse 11, which says, "When I was a child, I spoke like a child, I thought like a child, and I reasoned like a child. But when I grew up, when I became a man, I put away those childish things." I notice it doesn't say, I put away those childlike things. I hope you take up the challenge to see what you can do to retain a little bit more of those childlike qualities that you can then take out into your workplace and your communities, so that we can all have a life that is full of more curiosity, full of more wonder, and again, more childlikeness.